Welcome to Product AMA, your daily online Ask Me Anything. We started Product AMA to give those passionate or curious about product management a daily break, something to look forward to. Our topic for today is what product managers need to know about data privacy, security, and ethics. And joining us to explore the topic is Sharon Bauer, founder of Bamboo Data Consulting. So a thing or two about Sharon. She's a privacy consultant and lawyer who advises clients on privacy regulations and operationalizes privacy programs for her clients, acting as a virtual chief privacy officer. Sharon, welcome to Product AMA. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Terrific. Well, listen, let's just go ahead and get started. And as an icebreaker, as we call it, why don't you tell us an interesting fact about yourself?
Yeah, so that was one of those questions that you had asked me in advance of this recording. And I was just telling you how difficult it is to think of something interesting about yourself. The one thing that I guess I came up with, I am a mother of two, a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. And at the time, as I was having my babies, I was a partner at a law firm. And was trying to juggle having a successful practice and trying to be a good mother. And what I realized was that I was learning a lot from my children, and I applied it to my practice and vice versa. And in recognizing that and building strategies to help me interact with my clients and also interact with my children, I ended up writing a series of humorous articles for a legal magazine called The Precedent. And these articles were well received, and I compared what it's like to cross-examine my child and cross-examine my client. Or I wrote about how to plan for a birthday party and how that's similar for planning for a trial. Or the other one was planning for a new sibling to come into the home and planning for a new associate to come into the firm. And I think that whole experience made a very difficult situation of being a new mother and partner of a law firm. It made it a little bit lighter and just easier to handle. And I think that trying to compare different experiences and different feelings, as we're all humans, I think that also probably led to the name of my company, Bamboo Data Consulting. And a lot of people wonder, where did Bamboo come from? Well, Bamboo came because as I entered into a very tech-driven world where, I have to deal with privacy and security, I realized that, again, there is this other element of humans, and we're all human, and we all have emotions, and we all want to, take care of each other and protect each other. And as I thought about tech and I thought about nature and humans, I thought Bamboo had all of those qualities that I wanted to represent. So Bamboo, for example, has the qualities of being strong and fast growing and durable, yet very flexible and agile. And that's something that I wanted to bring to my clients, but I also thought that that's what my clients wanted to be themselves. A lot of them wanted to grow quickly and be agile and flexible and have, really strong roots that are wide reaching, yet very vertical as they grow. So, I, as a person, try to find different analogies to help me deal with the madness around me.
No, that's amazing. Thanks for sharing that story with us. So we're absolutely going to need to get a link or two to those articles and share them around when we share around the YouTube video. So I hope they're still published on the website of that magazine, and you can share those with me afterwards. And the thought that you just put into clearly a very strong brand proposition and key messages around your company is really fantastic to hear. So why don't you tell us a little more about Bamboo Data Consulting, just some of the services and kind of the work that you're generally doing with clients, just so we can familiarize ourselves with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a boutique firm, and we specialize in privacy. So we do privacy consulting and legal services, which makes us quite unique in the industry. You don't often find consulting and legal in one shop. So for the majority, our clients usually ask us to evaluate their privacy maturity or their privacy posture by conducting privacy risk assessments, and then advising them on how to remediate those risks. And essentially, a lot of them end up asking us to implement those recommendations. So we often build out privacy programs for our clients. It starts with a privacy policy, and it moves all the way up into creating an entire enterprise-wide governance structure, to building out data or process maps, to helping their designers implement privacy into the product. But we also act as virtual chief privacy officers. And those are usually for companies who are small enough that they don't need to hire someone full-time to handle their privacy function, or they don't have the resources to hire someone. And not all organizations need a full-time chief privacy officer, but all organizations certainly need to think about their privacy risks, as they do have legal obligations to fulfill. Apart from advising on privacy risks and acting as chief privacy officers, we also are retained to do due diligence. And that due diligence could be vendor due diligence, as third parties often have privacy risks themselves that our clients don't want to impose on themselves. Or it could also be mergers and acquisitions. So either a company is trying to get ready to be acquired, and so they want to make sure that they have as little privacy risks as possible so they become more attractive. Or it could be a company that is doing the acquiring and they don't want to acquire all the risks associated with a particular business. Also, we help companies when they experience privacy breaches. So what do they do? Do they notify regulators? How do they notify affected individuals? What are their legal obligations? As well as privacy training. So it all starts with the people in your organization. If they don't know what privacy is, if they don't understand your policies and procedures, you can't expect them to actually implement any privacy program that you have. So we do a whole bunch of things, all related to privacy. So it's very, very niche.
Well, thanks for explaining all of that. And I might be dating myself a little bit when I say this, but I'm thinking about the movie Pulp Fiction and the Harvey Keitel character, the wolf. And it's certain, and I don't know if you've seen that movie or not. I suspect
No.
Lee has, and Rhythm, you got to see it if you haven't. It seems like you were called in to clean up the mess, or to anticipate the mess, so the company doesn't have anything to clean up. Although it might not be a topic that many people understand in the product world, which we're about to get into in a moment, it certainly sounds like you play an incredibly important role that every company needs to be considering. And I guess that's kind of the challenge, is are they taking it seriously enough so that they have you in advance of a problem? And if you want to talk about that now, I'm happy for you to continue on the path and maybe talk to us a little bit about maybe how companies find you. And again, this is not a sales related session that we do here, but I think it's kind of important for the audience to just understand how you fit in to the ecosystem, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think that you touched on one of the biggest challenges that I face being a privacy professional, that a lot of companies, I don't want to say the majority, but there's still a lot of companies that aren't thinking about privacy until something happens to them. And then they realize, why didn't we know about this? Or why didn't we have proper procedures in place? And they're not able to demonstrate to regulators, once they do experience a privacy breach, that they had a privacy program in place. And that's when you're going to see the fines and the class action lawsuits. A lot of organizations are starting to put their mind to it because consumers are demanding it. as we're starting to see more headlines in the newspapers about privacy breaches, and we're starting to see the reputational harm that's associated with those headlines, more and more companies are recognizing the need to implement privacy. And it almost, of course, it's a compliance exercise for them, but those companies who are completely dedicated to privacy will certainly be at a competitive advantage over a lot of other businesses in their industry. And what we've seen and what studies have shown is that the more you become consumer-centric in the sense of implementing privacy, the more consumers you get because they trust you more, but also the more data you collect because consumers are more willing to give up their data. And we're also seeing an increase in the interest of privacy because regulators and prominent leaders in our community are starting to talk about privacy more. And the reason they're doing that is because they realize that there is a wonderful digital economy that's making a lot of money for a lot of people. But they also recognize the fact that all of this can go so poorly, and there could be, it could all backfire on so many businesses if businesses are not handling privacy or handling data in a responsible way. And so in order to increase and make the digital economy more successful, they want consumers to feel like they could trust the companies, the organizations, the products and platforms that they're using and give up more of their data.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how that works inside of the company. So you either work with a chief privacy officer or you act as one on an outsourced basis. And this is all about product AMA. So we're looking at, right now, we'll look at kind of the chief product officer, the head of product. And why don't you kind of talk us through, how in your capacity you're working with leaders like that inside of an organization and really thinking about more the product development part of your role, how you're informing the product kind of to be built. We can also talk about how you deal with products that are already built that then you're cleaning up. But for this question, I really want to think more about doing a project, what I would call the right way, so that your considerations, whether that's you directly or the company maybe can figure this out on their own because they're a mature enough company, are taking these factors into the product roadmap and the decision-making all along the way.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And truthfully, most of my engagements in my entire experience in privacy is usually when a product has already been built. And everyone gets really nervous because they have to either redesign or make some revisions, which costs the company money, which wastes time, or they may find that they can't actually use the data that they've collected because they didn't obtain proper consent, or they're using it for a different purpose for which they originally obtained their consent. So getting privacy advice at the very start, at the very design of a product is so essential. And that's what privacy by design is all about. And you may have heard about that term. It is a Canadian-born concept. And the concept is that you embed privacy at the forefront. You don't let it be an afterthought. And privacy by design is now actually federal data protection regulation in the EU. It's Article 25, privacy. With any new product or service or process. So in terms of those companies that do hire me, and those are usually the startups, and it's really very mindful of privacy, and they want to make sure that they have that competitive advantage, that they could tell their users that they do have privacy in mind and they are protecting their data. So when I come in there, first and foremost, how are they collecting it? Who are they collecting it from? And then look at their privacy obligations. So for example, if you start at the collection stage, you look at Are you collecting data from residents in the EU? Because if you are, then you need to design a bunch of features in, say it's an application, you need to design a bunch of features in your application to comply with the GDPR. So for example, are you able to allow individuals access to their data? Are you able to delete their data if they request it? That's just, one small example. But then we look at the entire data life cycle. So from collection, we look at, okay, now how are you using it? And who are you disclosing it to? How are you storing it? Is it encrypted, for example? Is it anonymized? Are you aggregating the data? And if so, to what degree? When you share it or disclose it with third parties, are you revealing personal data? Do you have consent to do that? And then how long are you retaining that data for? Do you have an automated system whereby when a user deletes their account, all that data is deleted? Or are you retaining it for a certain amount of time? And why are you retaining it? And if you are just discarding that data, how are you safely discarding that data? So it's really looking at the entire data life cycle. Now, I also help, a product can't live on its own. There's a whole ecosystem around a product. And so when I assess for privacy, I look, of course, at the technology. So let's just say that is the product, but I also look at governance. So what policies and procedures do you have to make sure that that entire data life cycle is formalized in those policies and procedures? But then I also look at people. I look at who's accountable, who is going to monitor and oversee this entire process. Because if one of these three elements is offside or is not strong enough, it can all fall apart, resulting in a breach.
All right. Well, everything you just described was fantastic. I'm surprised you had time to even join us today, because it sounds like your phone should just be ringing off the hook with people asking for your help. So thanks for joining us today. So for those of you who joined us in progress, we're speaking with Sharon Bauer. She's the founder of Bamboo Data Consulting. As you've already heard, she's an absolute expert in the field. And we'd like to hear your questions. So for now, we have a question. So Lee's asked a question, and maybe you can help us with this a little, Sharon. So Lee is just looking a little broader than the penalties. I know that's generally we hear about the breaches, we hear about to a lesser degree the penalties, but when you look at the organizations that you're working with and helping, what are the other considerations that they're thinking about around good data practices and good privacy practices? And I'll give you a couple examples that you can build on. So one is partners, people who want to work with them if they're sharing data. That might be a consideration. Another one potentially is, we'll call them investors or owners, but basically the stakeholders around the ownership of the company. And there might be many, many others. Of course, you're the expert. So help us understand a little bit about, beyond just not having a breach and getting a penalty, what else companies really need to be thinking about around their policies.
You know what, that is actually a wonderful question. I'm going to start it off by giving you a very interesting fact, which recently came out. It was actually just before the pandemic hit. The IAPP-EY governance report indicated that companies are going to invest, I think actually 55% of companies are willing to invest in privacy. And when I say invest in privacy, I mean actually put more money into privacy, whether they have already or are about to. And the reason for that is they felt that it was a good return on their investment. So yes, we've already spoken about the breaches. It's a great way to mitigate a breach. Now, before I move away from breaches, one other thing I want to say, nothing can absolutely prevent a breach, okay? The breaches are going to happen, but what you can do is be prepared for a breach. You can try to mitigate the risk, but you're not going to get it to a 0% risk. It's not possible. If you're going to invest in privacy, it is a great way to demonstrate that you have taken all measures to mitigate the harm as a result of a breach. You may not be able to mitigate the breach, but you can mitigate the harm. So I'm going to stop with the breach from now.
Well, that was, now we have you on record as saying that. So I guess for the insurance companies that are out there who have the E&O type policies, I guess that's already baked into the premiums.
Yeah. Well, and also for all of you who don't have cyber insurance, go and get it today. It's probably the best investment you'll make. But apart from breaches, companies are investing in privacy for all sorts of reasons. I've already touched on building trust and loyalty with your customers. And the more trust, or rather the more privacy centric you are, the more you can demonstrate that we care about your data. We are responsible. It is our number one priority. You're going to see an uptake in your users and in your customers, and you're going to see an uptake in the data that they share with you, which of course will further enable your business. So we're seeing that. We're also seeing that companies become more attractive to investors, because as I mentioned before, there's less of a risk when you know that the company that you're investing in or that you are acquiring doesn't have all those privacy breaches or doesn't have privacy risks that you need to worry about, or data that you are acquiring and you don't know if that data, if they obtain that data in a proper way, in a responsible way, if they have consent from their users for the new company to then use their data. So that plays a huge role. And then operational efficiency, I think that the more governance that you have around your privacy function, the easier everything becomes, right? It's
one more thing not to worry about, perhaps.
Yeah, but also everyone then it becomes on the same page. And for example, like I'm working with a company right now as a virtual chief privacy officer, and we're building out this privacy program. And at first, yes, everyone is a little bit hesitant because it's new policies, new procedures, new habits, and people get anxious over it. But then as soon as you start to implement it and people start to use their privacy policies and procedures internally, it almost becomes second nature. And it creates more efficiency because you're able to handle a lot more privacy inquiries or privacy issues that come up. Whereas before, you wouldn't know what to do and everyone's looking to someone else to figure out who's responsible. So setting out proper governance, policies, and procedures really makes this whole operation so much more efficient.
It sounds a lot like just regular change management with any kind of new process or procedure, especially when we're talking about growing companies, not startups. Let's go beyond startups, but although startups should absolutely be considering their privacy from the beginning, but typically, when companies are scaling, when there is a broader investor set, or when there's public stakeholders, they absolutely have to think about the things that you're talking about, and it has to be just part of. And the expression I like to use is just part of the DNA of the company. Thinking a little forward to when maybe we go back to offices and whatnot. And some of you might be already, the protocols in place there is just another example of, the necessary steps to do business, and privacy, although we might not be able to see it as easy as some other procedures, it's got to be a part of it from what I'm listening to anyway, from understanding everything that you're explaining to us today, Sharon. Yeah,
absolutely. And, the one other thing that I'm going to add to that is privacy really has to start from the top. And what I mean by that is there must be a privacy culture, and you can't create a privacy culture unless the people at the top take it seriously. And, if you're going to have a CPO where the board of directors or the executive management doesn't hear about privacy, they don't talk about privacy, the CPO's role is going to be very, very difficult. You need to instill that culture in your organization. So when I get those phone calls from startups and they're talking to me about privacy, it's music to my ears, because I know that the people at the top, they're thinking about it right from the beginning, and they're going to instill that culture in their business, in their entire organization. So for those who are listening, it is vital to have that tone from the top. Otherwise, you're not going to have a successful privacy program.
Oh, that's great. And I'm really happy that we have you on Product AMA to share some of this. We have not really heard about privacy in the last 3 months as we've been doing these. But I know that there are episodes of breaches, or maybe there's a different angle that you can take. But what I did want to have a little bit of fun for a moment. And I hope it doesn't impact any of your future client engagements. But if you could share with us, I'll call it a horror story, because when I was writing the questions, that's what came to mind. But it's a horror story in your world and potentially in a client's world or a company's world. Talk to us about an experience that you're aware of, maybe that you haven't had yourself, that will bring all of this into focus for us.
Okay. So I'm going to try to stick away from my personal experiences where I helped some clients just to protect their confidentiality. But before I directly answer that question in typical lawyer fashion, I'll give you some information that I think users should be aware of. When people think about breaches, they're often picturing a hacker sitting in his basement with a hoodie on, trying to hack into a system. And it's likely going to be a really big company because they have the big bucks, and that's the way it works. And it might work that way sometimes, but most of the time, it doesn't work that way. I think a lot of consumers, or rather your viewers, would be surprised to know that 43% of breaches happen to small businesses. And it happens to them because they're not prepared and they don't have the proper infrastructure to protect the personal information that they're collecting. And therefore, they're not protecting the consumers that are entrusting them with their personal information. So they're such an easy target. And that's something that everyone should be aware of. It doesn't matter if you're a small business. It doesn't matter if you're not collecting, really important personal information, like sensitive information. Personal information has value. And whether you're big or small, you are at risk and you are a target. The other thing that I want to mention is that you'd be surprised to know that a lot of the breaches are not a result of someone hacking into your system, but rather it could be employee negligence. Someone inadvertently disclosed information that they should not have. It could be an employee who has gone rogue, maybe a disgruntled employee, or it could be glitches in your system. And that's probably where your product managers and designers really need to think about privacy. Because again, if they don't have privacy in mind, they may not realize that there are certain glitches in their system. So for example, an example of glitch, I would say, is a breach that happened recently. It's a health app and it's called Babylon. And users are engaging with doctors virtually, and they have their medical appointment, except it's virtual. And what happened recently is that one of their users got a hold of a ton of other users' conversations with healthcare providers, and that person had no reason to get those recordings, but they did, and that's certainly a breach. And they blamed it on a glitch in the software, right? And I feel for them, because this, you didn't even have a rogue employee. This was something that was inadvertent, really. But again, if you're not going to catch on to these little glitches and thinking about who may be able to gain access or how information flows through the ecosystem, you're going to end up with a glitch like that. Another example, again, so unfortunate, is ADT. Recently, it was brought to ADT's attention by one of their customers that they noticed an email address on their account that belonged to someone at ADT. And when ADT investigated it further, what they noticed was that it was one of their technicians. And when that technician put together this individual's account, he also put in his own email address, which allowed him access into the security camera within their home. And I mean, I can't imagine anything more scary. But again, who was looking at, those privacy issues? And I'm certainly not suggesting that, this was intentional on ADT, but, if we had proper controls in place, then maybe we would have been able to prevent a situation like that. But even more so, and I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, would a privacy professional, if they assess this app, would they even be able to identify this as being an issue? Because are they looking deeply enough to be able to identify who can put in their email address into these accounts? They might not be able to identify that either. But maybe the product designer would, because they're the ones who are designing all of this. And if the product designer was talking to a privacy expert from the beginning, maybe this issue would have come up. So that's what I mean by privacy by design. That is the perfect example of where privacy by design may have been able to save this entire breach from happening.
Wow, those are great stories, and hopefully people they recognize ADT if they don't recognize the health app. I'd like to kind of continue on the path of maybe some of the examples that you gave here, because all of a sudden I was going down memory lane myself here with a couple of jobs that I had like a lifetime ago, where I won't say which loyalty program I worked for. You can see that on my LinkedIn if you care to, but I worked for a very big loyalty program, and I was 24. I was just out of business school, and I was an analyst, and I had to run fraud reports to look for anomalies in the awarding of points. And you talk about, the employee's email address and how that is probably very easily traceable. So comparing that to what I did earlier in my career, we would have suspicious, in this case, it was collector account numbers that we would be looking for anomalies, and pretty much people got fired because of some of the fraud that was going on deep within the system. And in this example for you, because you're a lawyer, it's perfect. So you can answer this maybe from an employment law or point of view. But what's wrong with organizations collecting not just the work email, obviously, of their employees, but also personal emails, and using that as part of either fraud detection or security regulation? Like, is that something that when you're talking to clients about how to protect themselves, you're saying, yep, you need to know more about your employees because they could be doing some damage right under your nose?
Absolutely. So the law says that you are allowed to collect personal information, including sensitive personal information, to prevent fraud. So collecting personal information of your employees for the purpose of preventing fraud, I would argue would be acceptable, so long as you are only using it for the purpose of preventing fraud and not for any other purpose. And that's where you must have very tight controls, procedures, policies, guidelines around that. And that's where companies can get themselves into trouble, that they collect information for one purpose and then use it for a different purpose. And I call that purpose creep. But in terms of employee access to data, I would say that's probably one of the biggest problems that we see. And all companies need to have a procedure or a process whereby employees work on a need to know basis. So you are not revealing any information to any employee unless they need to know that information, because you never know, again, whether an employee can go rogue or just be, inadvertently negligent, right? We all work really hard at a really fast pace. We all collect information. We may send an email to someone that we didn't mean to send it to. We sent it to the wrong person. We mailed an envelope to the wrong person accidentally. And so long as one person is affected by that breach, you're going to need to report it. You're going to need to protect yourself. So
there's a lot of booby traps in your line of work.
It really is. But again, if you're going to instill that culture, the privacy culture that I was talking about before, so that all employees have that at the top of their mind, they're trained to know, let me double check who I'm sending this email to. Take my time. Let me make sure that I'm not accessing something that I shouldn't. And if I am, to report it immediately. Then you're creating this culture where everyone is aware that they have their responsibilities and they know why they have those responsibilities and the importance of it.
Before we move on to some other questions, there's some great questions that are waiting for you. I want to just stick on this current theme for a moment, and Lee has brought forward this question. So if you could quickly, and maybe it's just like a bang, 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 bulleted list, when a company has a good privacy culture, what are those quick hits, those aspects that you're looking for to say, yeah, this is a good client for me. They know what they're doing, and I'm going to be able to take them to the next level.
So you want to know what a good privacy culture looks like?
What are some of those aspects? Quickly, I mean, let's say top 3. Let's not get to 10.
You need a CPO who understands privacy, who's educated in privacy so they can identify privacy risks and mitigate those risks. You need the CPO to be able to report to, or at least have a champion that goes all the way up to the executive or board level. And you need the board or the executive level to invest in privacy and provide the CPO, and if you don't have a CPO, then a designated person or a privacy function with the resources and the funding to enable them to do their job properly.
Okay, thank you for that. And let's clarify, Chief Privacy Officer, because we talk a lot about Chief Product Officer on Product AMA, but in your case, the CPO is the Chief Privacy Officer. Okay, thanks for that. And there's a question here that Anka is asking, and it's a question I know, Sharon, that you wanted to deal with. So thank you for teeing that up. Maybe you know this person. But looking at artificial intelligence and really looking current and forward, if you will, talk to us about policies and procedures or protocols, around artificial intelligence that kind of allow the technology to be used in an ethical way. And I'm not pretending to completely understand the question, but I'm hoping that you do.
Yeah, so I don't think I know Anka, but I expected this question because it is such an important issue these days, and I have worked with companies and their AI and evaluating privacy and ethics around their AI system. So thank you for asking. Wonderful question. So where to start? In Canada, we currently don't have any regulations that tell us what we can and cannot do with AI. Although we do have some guidance from our privacy commissioner on, best practices. We receive those best practices in that guidance probably because the GDPR, I had mentioned that one before, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is an EU privacy legislation, was one of the first legislations to cover AI, and not even in great detail. It's not entirely robust, but they definitely made us start thinking more about AI and privacy as well as ethics. So some challenges that we're seeing with AI is around decision making. It's all about how is a machine making a decision about an individual, and how are we making sure that that decision is not biased and that it is fair. And how are we going to identify how the machine made that decision when it's in a black box? And sometimes we don't even understand how it got to that decision. And so the GDPR is saying there must be some transparency in decision making when it's through artificial intelligence. There must also be some accountability, which means that there needs to be a human in the loop to be able to look at the outcome of that decision and decide, is this fair or is this biased? Now, the GDPR also allows for individuals to opt out of any automated decision making. So if a machine is making a decision all on its own, so it's a sole decision-making process, then as an individual, I can opt out of that process. It allows me to do that. The other issue that we see is data minimization. So with AI and machine learning, you really need a vast amount of data for the machine to learn patterns. And the issue there is organizations need to minimize the data that they're collecting. So where are they collecting all this information from? Do they have consent to do it? What are they doing with it? Again, do they have consent to do what they're doing with it? Are they ensuring that there is anonymity so that the data is anonymous as they're working through all that and trying to find patterns? Again, there's also the issue of the ability to re-identify an individual. So even if you are anonymizing data, can the machine re-identify an individual as it gathers more data from other sources? And that is a huge concern. Now in Canada, as I mentioned, we don't have regulations around this, but we are expecting to see amendments to PIPEDA, which is our federal privacy regulation. And I know that the regulators have asked for consultation papers about AI and what privacy experts think should happen with AI in terms of regulating it. Should it be regulated? Maybe yes, maybe no. I guess it depends on what side you sit on.
I think for now, maybe it's fair that there is no regulation. It just seems like from what you've described, although you understand it very clearly, and apparently some of our audience do as well, which is fantastic. Very terrifying to think about the government regulating that, especially over the last few months as we've seen them try to regulate a whole bunch of other things like the economy, which
well then yeah, I mean you're right, but when I say should we regulate it, it means should we put limitations and provisions around how you can use AI. So if there is a concern that government is using it in certain ways that people don't feel comfortable with, then we do want it regulated, because we want to put some limits on how AI can be used and how individuals can exercise their rights around certain decisions that are made based on AI. So as an example, and I wrote a paper about this, can insurance companies make decisions about claims or decisions about premiums based on the information that they collect about you?
Well, it sounds like, and because you're a lawyer, I understand the base and the foundation of it. But it does sound like thinking about something like, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And does there need to be an AI, provision in there that protects us from bias, with the example you just gave about an insurance company? Again, I haven't thought a lot about this. I'm sure we need another hour or two to properly digest it. So for the sake of time.
It is a huge topic.
Yes,
Which is why I
yes.
said, where do we begin? It's fascinating. I love the topic. Yeah.
It'll be a follow-up under some other session that we do, not product AMA, but product by design AMA, perhaps, as Lee is asking for more information on that. But before we go there, I wanted to go back to a different question and really just talk about you before we run out of time. Because as part of product AMA, what we've learned over the last 3 months is that we get to meet these great people like yourself, and we get to learn about all the amazing things that you're doing. But a lot of this is really about virtual mentorship with the audience that is watching live and the audience that will consume later on demand. So why don't you take a few minutes and just talk to us about that pivot that you made in your career a few years ago from being a lawyer, then to being a consultant, and then running your own consulting practice with this specialization. And just maybe tell us a little bit about that journey and some of the whys in terms of why you did that.
Yeah, not wise, but wise.
Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully it'll be wise. Wow. Okay. So I started my career as a litigator. I was a litigator for 10 years. I became a partner 5 years after I started practicing. And quite honestly, I probably had a very successful career, one that I should have been very happy with. But there was something in me that felt that I was missing something, and I didn't know what it was. I very organically came across privacy, and it's kind of an embarrassing story, but it was because I watched the Snowden documentary, and that really opened my eyes. And I swear to you, that's where my journey started. I became fascinated by the topic. I did a lot more reading, research on it. I felt like I was blind, and finally, I saw the truth, and I wanted to explore it. And I was fascinated with it because I realized how much I loved technology and the convenience that technology gave me, but also very frightful of the negative social impact that data could potentially play a role in my life. And so that's where the journey began, this paradox that fascinated me. And I wanted to be a part of the solution. I wanted to figure out, how do we solve this problem? And it just became a passion. So I was very fortunate to have gotten an opportunity at KPMG. So I left my legal practice, and I decided to just completely pivot my career. I joined KPMG as a senior manager, where I received the most incredible experience. I worked with the most amazing people and amazing clients that, I otherwise would never have worked with, and really kind of immersed myself in that whole industry and paradox that I was talking about, and did a lot of writing. And for those who are watching and don't know how to get into this industry, I would recommend start writing. That's how I did it. And I always picked the topics that I knew the least about, because it forced me to learn them so I can actually sound a little intelligent when I wrote my articles. And start connecting and networking with people, because people in privacy and security, it is such a small community so far. It is no doubt going to explode, but it's a small community. And I truly believe that we're all kind of looking out for each other and wanting to help each other. And there's constantly new things coming up, like every day. It cannot get boring, and people want to talk about it. That's how you learn. So
well, that's a great story, Sharon, and thank you for sharing that with us. You clearly have a ton of excitement for this space, which is so important, and you're clearly passionate about it because you took that pivot and you're running with it. Now, with the time that we have left, because we do like to wrap up at the top of the hour, I want to deal with a topic that's a little more current, mm-hmm. and might be a little tougher to make our way through. But since we are in this pandemic, and I don't think you need to be a chief privacy officer to have been watching or listening or reading about the topic of contact tracing. To the best of my knowledge, I don't have an app on my phone which is officially contact tracing me in case I've come in contact with anyone who has contracted COVID-19. But I did read in preparation for our chat today that in Germany, an app has launched called the Corona Warning app, and it lets users know if they've come into contact with anyone who's contracted the virus. Now, the interesting thing about this app and there are lots of interesting things, by the way, is it's an open source project that's been funded by the government of Germany. The code itself has actually been posted to GitHub openly so people can look at it. And the two leading companies behind it in Germany are SAP and I believe it's pronounced Deutsche Telekom. And so it's had mixed reviews. From the article I was reading, 6.5 million people have downloaded it. And I forget the exact population of Germany, but that seems like a lot of people in a very short amount of time. And some of the backlash that I was reading about was that the app is using API for location tracking from Google and from Apple versus other standards that are available. So I know that you're not intimately familiar with this app and the technology behind it, but I know you do have an opinion on the topic of contact tracing. So I really just wanted to see your opinion on the line between privacy and public health and where you think it should exist.
Mm-hmm. That is a big one that a lot of privacy professionals are talking about right now. And, again, there's this paradox, right? It's always a paradox with privacy where you want to protect people in their lives and you also want to protect their privacy. And in this situation, which one should be weighed higher than the other? And there is no answer to that. I think, what I'll say is our privacy commissioner gave a statement. And he said that, privacy should not be ignored during this time. However, he said, it shouldn't be a barrier, essentially, to information sharing, especially when there's the ability to save lives. And I completely agree with that statement. There needs to be some sort of a balance. And there's nothing wrong with sharing information, especially when it can save the lives of individuals, so long as we use it responsibly. So if we're going to use it responsibly, it means that we are collecting only the information that we need to serve that purpose and nothing more. So that goes to the data minimization principle of privacy. You should anonymize that data. There's no reason why anyone should know the identity of an individual if it doesn't enhance the purpose. So again, data minimization, only reveal the information that is really necessary. Is it really necessary to reveal the identity of the individual? And then full transparency. So allow individuals to know that you are sharing information. And the best case scenario is obtain explicit consent from those individuals to share that information. Anything less, I think, will really compromise the integrity of our whole justice system. And I think that it is so important that we use, and this is where I guess where I'm really passionate about, if we're going to do this, then use it for that purpose only. Do not allow the government to then take that information and use it for a completely different purpose that is unrelated and that can violate the privacy of your citizens. And not just government, but we're talking about Google as well. They're collecting this information. That's fine because it's going to save the lives. And in fact, in our legislation, it's an exception. You don't necessarily need consent when there is an emergency situation such as this. That's okay. But then you only use it for this reason and nothing else. And then how long are you retaining that information for? Because if you're retaining it for longer than, this crisis, what are you going to do with it? So those are the main issues here.
All right. Well, thank you for breaking that down. And if you're looking for your next career pivot, I think you might have an opportunity in politics. Just a hint here.
I'm good. I've made enough changes already.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, we do have a question that I've been sitting on for a bit, but I think it's really relevant as we've begun to speak a little more international. So we can focus it on Canadian companies. And I don't know if you work for Shopify or not. I'm just using Shopify as an example here, so you don't have to speak specifically about them. But if we focus on Canadian companies who are doing business all over the world, and the privacy regulations are, to the best of my knowledge, kind of country to country. And we've seen this famously, whether it's the EU handing out fines or maybe other countries blocking providers. Let's say as a Canadian company, if you wish to provide your services globally,
Mm-hmm.
how do you manage that knowledge around regulations like in the United States versus Britain versus let's say China or Russia? Just talk to us a little bit about how if you have clients like that, or if you don't, just describe how you manage this world of regulation, overload.
Yeah, that is a really good question, and one that a lot of privacy professionals not have a hard time with, but there's always a different approach. And so there's no one right answer to that question. What I can say is, on the one hand, you have some companies that say, I will comply with privacy regulations depending on where the data came from. So if it's from the EU, I will comply with the EU only for those citizens whose data I'm collecting. But then if you're in Canada, I'm only going to comply with the Canadian legislation, and I'm not going to standardize it enterprise-wide. While other companies say, you know what, we're taking one approach. We're not going to do, a mishmash and puzzle pieces of different privacy regulations, because that becomes too complicated. I think it depends on the size of your company, the resources that you have to comply with different regulations. If you're going to comply with one, my recommendation is you comply with the strictest privacy regulation at the moment. For the most part, it's the GDPR. That is the gold standard. Strive for that, because we're also expecting PIPEDA to be revised, our legislation, and we're expecting to see, we're not going to see a complete mirror of the GDPR, but we're certainly going to see some elements of GDPR incorporated into PIPEDA. We just saw that happening with Quebec, where we just saw their proposals to amend the Quebec privacy regulations, and there's so many similarities to the GDPR. So GDPR is your gold standard.
Well, thank you for that. That you couldn't have been more clear around that. I wish I knew that a couple of years ago. I would have built some products a little different, but I don't work there anymore, so it's not my problem. I'm not a director. Listen, Sharon, it's been really amazing chatting with you today. I didn't know that I'd be getting a master's in privacy when I arranged for us to speak. But I think for those of us who join live, and certainly for those who are going to watch this later on YouTube, what an amazing education that you've given us today. I couldn't thank you enough for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Follow Product AMA on Twitter and send us your topic suggestions. We look forward to seeing you soon.